This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 968 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Late last week, you heard an episode on some of the bigger things that I got wrong this past year. I talked about the item that was wrong and whether or not that item was actually predictable or not, or if I used correct process while making the decision that I ended up making as an analyst. Today's show is the opposite of that. It's the things that went right. I think a lot of times when things go your way, you just assume that they went your way because of course they did. You were smart. You did something correctly. You don't need to go any further. You were right. But it's still really imperative to see if luck played a factor or if your process was wrong. Because there were some instances this year where the result definitely went my way, but I wasn't predicting the why correctly. And to me, that's just as important as predicting the end result correctly. So we'll talk through some of those bigger things that went my way this year. I tried to come with a variety of things just to cover everything. Now, before getting to the items today, do you guys know that the 2025 best ball season is already underway over at Underdog? For real. You can join big board contests right now over there for all different entry prices. You can really have an edge in your competition right now if you understand prospects better than the market, and I know some of you do. That's what helped me get into the big board final last year. Now, I haven't created rankings for it yet, but I will soon enough over on the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. To get ready for that, make sure you sign up on UnderdogFantasy.com and use promo code LATEROUND when you do sign up. That'll get you a nice deposit bonus up to $1,000. That's promo code LATEROUND. And also the Late Round Prospect Guide, it's available for pre-order. Just head to LateRound.com to make the purchase. It'll give you everything you need to crush your rookie drafts this year. But the information in it can definitely help with season long too. You can see samples of what you get over on LateRound.com if you're still deciding. The price for the Prospect Guide, it's currently $14.99. It's going to rise to $19.99 once it launches on March 10th. Then it's going to be updated after the NFL draft happens. You get all of that for just a $14.99 pre-order. That's all on LateRound.com. Check it out. A good place to start this show is probably with Brian Thomas Jr. For those of you who listened to Becoming a Best Ball Bro, that series over the summer, you might remember that Brian Thomas was my highest rostered wide receiver in best ball last year. Anyone who listens to my friends over at the Fantasy Footballers for their MVP show, Brian Thomas was my preseason submission as this year's fantasy football MVP. Needless to say, I was really high on him entering the season. And this is a case where the result was even better than I anticipated. But I think the process was also spot on. One of the reasons I love having my prospect guide, my draft guide, is that I can look back and easily see how I was feeling about a player or a situation before the season started. I, of course, enjoy spreading research and getting my thoughts out there to the masses. But I selfishly love having these almost like journals of my thoughts entering a season. Brian Thomas was a volatile prospect because he didn't have multiple huge seasons in college, but the ZAP model liked him more than most did. But what's important for today's discussion is what I said about him in the draft guide. In this year's guide, Brian Thomas was a player to target, obviously. And in his blurb, I wrote the following, quote, Thomas's prospect score was 94.5, a number that typically yields good fantasy results. Which, by the way, with some adjustments that I made to the model this offseason or over the last few weeks, that score actually now looks even better. More on that in the prospect guide, though. But I continue and I say, since 2014, we've had 23 rookie wide receivers get selected in the wide receiver 40 to wide receiver 60 range with a prospect score above 90. Those players, on average, outperformed ADP expectation by 1.4 PPR points per game, and a crazy high 39% of them finish as a moderate breakout. And remember, rookies will typically perform better during the back half of the season compared to the front one. I then went on to write, and say what you want about Calvin Ridley playing that role last year. Not only did he have some unfortunate touchdown luck, but he still maintained a 22.4% target share. According to PFF's modeling, Ridley finishes the wide receiver 14 in expected fantasy points last season. And Ridley wasn't getting drafted as the wide receiver 50 last year. So essentially, ADP trends pointed to Brian Thomas being an obvious pick. The market undervalued this type of player in the past. That player being a talented player. And then on top of that, the potential workload was there. He would take on that Calvin Ridley role, which wasn't amazing for Ridley from a results standpoint, but Ridley underperformed. When you can get a middle round wide receiver who's this good of a prospect, you should want to take on that risk. You want to take on that variance. And when that player also has a path to volume, same exact deal. Now, Brian Thomas ended up performing better than even I expected. But in fantasy football, it's not simply about being precise. It's not about predicting the outlier. It's about liking the outlier more than your league mates. And that's what happened with me when it came to Brian Thomas. Now, someone who was in a similar boat as Thomas was Ladd McConkey. But number one, my prospect model didn't like McConkey as much as it liked Thomas. So he didn't fit that criteria as well. That resulted in me not calling him out as a player to target, which was a mistake because McConkey balled out. But I don't think I was totally wrong with McConkey this year. I was more or less around market with him entering the season, but I adjusted that stance quickly with new information. Within the 15 Transactions newsletter and podcast that went out before week 6, so through 5 weeks of the season, I had Ladd McConkey as a buy. And it wasn't because he was balling out, quite the opposite. After 5 weeks, he was averaging 11.2 PPR points per game. Nothing special. But the peripherals were there. And sometimes, even if the environment doesn't look super attractive, that's enough to pounce. McConkey had a 27% target share through that point in time. His lowest share in a single game, 21%. His yards per route run at that time was just outside the top 20 across the entire league. And that was for a rookie wide receiver who had only played a month of football. You then take that and you layer on top the fact that my research has pointed to rookies performing better during the second half of the year versus the first, and you had yourself a great buy candidate. Remember, at that time, LA was a pretty run-heavy team because Justin Herbert was banged up. And McConkey's upcoming schedule wasn't that great either. But from that transaction onward, even though it took a few weeks, McConkey averaged 16.4 PPR points per game. And then he obviously had that blow-up game in the wildcard round. He now has the third best year 2 score in my year 2 model behind Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. McConkey is legit, and we saw that pretty early on in the season by looking at his peripherals. Anytime there's a first-year player showing out like that, you need to be aggressive. It won't work every time, but the cost benefit is usually there. Anyone who listens to this show knows my style. I don't talk in absolutes because there are no absolutes in fantasy football. We should live in the gray area and not just think in a black and white way. But one of my key players to avoid this year, one where I did feel pretty strongly, was with Zamir White. The running back dead zone was indeed different this year, and that's something I had written about before the season. But there were still traditional dead zone backs in the lower end RB2 range of drafts. And the most glaringly obvious one to me was Zamir White. White was being drafted for two main reasons. Number one, he finished the 2023 season off strong. Number two, who else was going to touch the ball in the Raiders' backfield? Now, I need that second item to be stuck in your brain for the rest of the time that you play fantasy football, which is hopefully the rest of your life. Never draft players high in your fantasy drafts because of a lack of competition around them. Draft players because they're good at the game. Because average players, they're replaceable, even if you can't foresee who that replacement's going to be. Maybe you felt Zamir White was good, but I'd argue there were a lot of red flags to his overall profile. White was never a pass catcher, not at Georgia, and not really in the NFL either. Even when you look at how he performed during his strong final month of 2023, he was averaging a target share per game rate below 10%. Not only is pass catching important for fantasy scoring, but it's a talent marker as well. A more well-rounded running back sees those looks. White also hadn't done that much in the NFL up until that point. Now you can say it's because Josh Jacobs was there. Okay, fine. But White also wasn't some high-end draft selection. The reason the Raiders had him in the first place, despite already having Josh Jacobs on their roster, was because they didn't have to spend a lot of draft capital to get Zamir White. Like even down the stretch the previous season in 2023, when Zamir White was playing at his best, He averaged 14.1 PPR points per game. That was fine, but it was nowhere near special. It just seemed obvious that things had a chance to go south this year. Now, did I project this? Not necessarily. But of all the running backs in fantasy football to not live up to the hype, he seemed like the easy go-to because people were drafting him for the wrong reasons. And that's definitely a process that I'm going to continue to implement moving forward. Draft the player first, situation second. A little bit later in the draft, after Zamir White, came a group of my favorite running backs to target, and those are the running backs in ambiguous backfields. But this isn't about ambiguous backfields being okay once again in 2024. This is about patience with those ambiguous backfields, specifically with Chase Brown. Now, I went on a journey with Brown last year. I had first started the offseason thinking that he was more of a sell. Then I changed my tune a month or two later after doing more research. Because that's how I operate. When I get new information, when I discover new things, I might change my mind. Brown then ended up being a player that I was heavily targeting both in best ball and season-long leagues, all summer long. Now, I didn't think that Zach Moss, who was also part of that backfield, I didn't think that he was a bad choice either. But I moved Chase Brown ahead of Moss in my rankings when that wasn't that popular of a thing to do. Now, obviously, that end result ended up being the right move. Zach Moss was hurt, and Chase Brown took over that backfield. He became an RB1 in fantasy football. But I think the path to getting to that point, that's what's important here. After 2 weeks of the season, I had a 15 transactions item that was to hold Chase Brown. People were contemplating dropping him with Zach Moss taking on more work in that Bengals backfield. In weeks 1 and 2, Chase Brown had a 25% running back rush share. Zach Moss, he had the other 75%. But ambiguous backfield targeting is all about patience. It's not unlike zero RB. The idea behind targeting ambiguous backfields is that drafters tend to push down running backs who are in a projected split backfield because they say to themselves, he's not going to see a full workload. Why should I draft him? But what that fails to recognize is the paths that a running back can take in order to see a larger workload. Our projections are not going to be 100% correct. Now, one of those paths is via talent. The running back is just undeniably better than his teammate. That gives him more work. The other path is an injury path. If his teammate gets hurt, then the other running back will likely see more work. Now, ambiguous backfields don't work out 100% of the time, not even close. But the hit rates for running backs in these backfields in the middle to late rounds, they're a whole lot better than the hit rates for running backs in those same rounds who appear to have their backfield to themselves, like Zamir White this past year or Ramondre Stevenson. Now, you may not immediately understand why that'd be the case. So just think of it this way. Why were Ramondre Stevenson and Zamir White drafted as lower-end RB2s in 2024? If they had their backfields themselves, why wouldn't drafters want them even more? Well, it's likely due to their situation or maybe a talent issue. For White, it was kind of both. For Stevenson, it was probably a little bit of both too, but it was more of a situational one. For players in ambiguous backfields, the market is telling you that that backfield has so much potential. It has so much potential that they're willing to draft multiple running backs from that same backfield with relatively high-end picks, despite a split backfield. That tells you that situationally, it's probably a good place to be. And that's exactly what we had with the Bengals. And with Chase Brown, after 2 weeks, it was pretty evident that he was the better running back versus Zach Moss. Every rushing metric, and I mentioned this when talking about Brown as a hold, but every rushing metric painted a favorable picture for Brown over Moss. The Bengals just hadn't gotten to that point yet, probably due to pass protection. Now, I finished off the blurb by stating the following about Chase Brown. I said, quote, "At the very least, Brown serves as a handcuff stash on your bench. There's still time for him to create a larger role for himself, though. Moss has not run away with the job yet, even if his peripherals are far, far better." So we led with the talent. We led with Chase Brown being good. And as the weeks went on, even before the Zach Moss injury, Brown did get more and more work because of that talent. And then the upside really hit when Zach Moss was hurt. Now, I can sit here and say that the injury piece was lucky, and it was to some degree. Anytime an injury occurs, there's some randomness to it. But some players benefit from injury more than others, like players in ambiguous backfields. So no, I wasn't totally right with Chase Brown all year long, but I'm really pleased with how I adapted to new information and how I leaned in on the talent when things weren't going well to start the year. That patience really paid off. Now, another player who was in an ambiguous backfield this past year was Najee Harris. And for a chunk of the season, he was actually looking decent for drafters. The season kind of started rough with Justin Fields under center, but when Russell Wilson became starter, things changed. Harris was averaging 15.6 PPR points per game during a 7-game stretch from week 6 to week 13. He seemed to score every week. But during that stretch, I had multiple transactions of Najee Harris being a sell. In the short term, those looked pretty bad because one of them happened after week 6, right before this big stretch. Another after week 10, which was only a few weeks before his biggest outing of the season, where he scored almost 25 PPR points. Part of the reason I had Harris as a sell was because of Jaylen Warren. Not only did Warren pass the eye test more, but he was starting to carve out a bigger role in that offense. But another key reason was the schedule component. Pittsburgh had a brutal playoff schedule for running backs. Even if Harris helped you get there, you weren't going to be able to rely on him during that time frame. And honestly, you could say the same thing about Joe Mixon and me talking about Mixon as a sell. Now, I definitely screwed up that transaction because when I made it, I was actually higher than the market on Mixon with my rest of season rankings. But I warned about his playoff schedule too. Harris, though, was facing the Eagles, Ravens, and Chiefs in the fantasy playoffs. It was a brutal stretch. He ended up scoring 3, 4, and 10 PPR points in those 3 games. Now, I wanted to call this one out today because it's a good example of why those playoff matchups can matter. We won't always get them right, but it's typically a little bit easier to get it right at running back. And it's easier to get it right when it's such an extreme. With Harris, it was at a massive extreme given those really tough matchups. And look, we don't want playoff matchups to dictate everything. Remember, always lead with the player first, with his talent. But it's a lot easier to let those playoff matchups influence how you feel about a player's value when that player is not a special talent. And also when they've gotten by just by touchdowns. It just wasn't sustainable for Harris to do that against teams like Baltimore and Kansas City. I did an entire episode last summer on the pocket passer trap. And the quintessential trap in 2024 was CJ Stroud. Now, I don't need to spend a lot of time on this because everything was said on episode 887. But the TLDR is that we've seen really poor hit rates from earlier round quarterbacks who don't bring any rushing juice to the table. And that's because passing numbers, specifically passing touchdowns or touchdown rate, passing numbers are more volatile than rushing ones are. Pocket passers are generally more replaceable. It's not to say that a pocket passer can't have a great season. In fact, I even said that CJ Stroud still had really good odds of being on the higher side in touchdown passes this year. But that's one part where this process was good, but the result was even worse than I anticipated. Right? I saw CJ Stroud as a fade, but I didn't think he was going to be this bad. After Stroud's rookie season, I wasn't prepared for him to throw just 20 touchdowns and have a touchdown rate of 3.8%, not with the weapons that he had. But I do think the market made a lot of assumptions about CJ Stroud and his inevitable progression from year 1 to year 2. And obviously there were assumptions made about the wide receiver room when that wide receiver room couldn't stay healthy. The thing is, though, this is less about CJ Stroud and his evaluation and more about how the game of fantasy football is played. Take a look at the top quarterbacks in fantasy football from 2024. Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Baker Mayfield, Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels. Those were the guys who were giving you an actual edge for the most part week to week. Jackson, Allen, Hurts, and Daniels all got there because of their mobility. You could even argue that Baker Mayfield did to a degree as well. But Mayfield was a late round pick, if he was drafted at all. The only guy who sort of bucked the pocket passer trend was Joe Burrow. But he needed 652 pass attempts to get there and one of the worst defenses that our eyes have ever seen. He needed those ultra favorable game scripts. And of course, Joe Burrow is a boss. He's very, very good at quarterback. But situationally, things really lined up for him. And that's really hard to predict. Now, I thought about calling out Jaden Daniels here as a win, and he was, because he was a go-to target for me. But I think it's more insightful to talk about the pocket passer trap, because we saw it in action once again this year. If you're going to get a pocket passer, wait until the double-digit rounds to select that pocket passer. At least don't get him in the top 6 when the opportunity cost includes some legitimate mobile quarterbacks, because the upside is rarely there. I talked about Jalen Waddle last week as one of my biggest misses of the season, but I didn't get everything wrong in Miami, because Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith, they were both on my target list in 2024. This is a classic case, though, where the results were good, but the process was not perfect. My stance on drafting Achane was that we'd figured he'd be efficient, even though his numbers were bound to regress. But even with regressed numbers, there was so much potential for him to see more work in general, both through the air and on the ground. And that was correct. The last part, definitely there. But Achane went from being the most efficient running back in the history of the league to dropping his yards per attempt rate to just above average. Achane took massive hits across the board. His rate of gaining 10 or more yards went from over 21% in 2023 to 10% this past year. His 20-plus yard run rate dropped by more than half. He was gaining positive yards at a lower rate. Any way you look at it, he regressed as a runner. But this is a really good example of why we need to look at volume over efficiency in fantasy football. Even when we're talking about one of the most efficient seasons that we've ever seen in the history of the league. Achane saw his running back rush share per game rise by 13 percentage points year over year. Most importantly, his target share per game went from 10.4% to 15.3%. He caught 78 passes this past year. That really was the key difference for him year over year. Achane was able to mitigate all regression by simply seeing more volume across the board. And there was a lot of regression on the efficiency front. That's what we were hoping to have happen. That's why he was the RB6 in PPR points per game, and he was even better when Tua was healthy. Now with Jonnu Smith, I look back at my blurb about him, and I was right to point out that Miami didn't have a player like Jonnu Smith playing tight end for them under Mike McDaniel. But never in a million years did I expect him to basically outpace Tyreek Hill during the second portion of the season. I do think I did right by leading with talent, as I've been talking about all podcast long. But anyone trying to say that they knew that Jonnu Smith would do this, they're lying to you. The lesson here, though, is that talent can indeed create opportunity. I think we saw that to a degree with both Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith. Now, there were 2 items that I was thinking about talking about on today's show, but realized it's probably a little bit too much. One was sticking with Jalen McMillan despite the poor performances when Chris Godwin went down, and the other one was with Malik Neighbors and being higher on him than the market entering the year. But both kind of fall into that rookie wide receiver bucket that I talked about earlier. Whether it's drafting an elite player like Neighbors because the talent's there, or being patient as a less elite player learns the NFL game a little bit better. The second half of the year is great for those guys. Instead, I want to finish today's show with one of my favorite calls of the season. Now, I don't know if it was the most impactful. The Chase Brown one was probably the most impactful, but it's just one of my favorites. There was a mailbag question that I received earlier in the season asking for a running back who could just naturally take over his backfield without an injury. And without any real workload from this player up until that point, the guy that I pointed to was Tyrone Tracy. I'm just really happy about my process with Tyrone Tracy in the Giants' backfield this past year. Now, this one really wasn't ambiguous. Everyone assumed that Devin Singletary would be the lead guy, and that's how the season started. But my lean towards Tyrone Tracy was due to a few things. First, Singletary clearly wasn't a can't-miss player. I know he had a history with Brian Dable, but it wasn't like Singletary was Christian McCaffrey, aka it was a climbable depth chart. Second, when you looked at that depth chart, you had Singletary and Eric Gray, 2 players who didn't have the best size speed profiles. They weren't super dynamic running backs. Tyrone Tracy was. At least that's how he was in college, and that's how he tested athletically. Now, the third thing is that Tyrone Tracy had a really intriguing receiving profile, given he was a converted wide receiver in college. That's something that wasn't obviously there for the other Giants running backs. So this was strictly a talent evaluation thing. And it was a talent evaluation thing layered on top of situation. Now, I'm always going to gravitate towards backs who bring a different dynamic to an offense, when the existing running backs are pretty ordinary in general. That's all this was. Tracy had to hit as a player, but there were marks showing that he would. And with some of the tweaks that I made with the prospect model over the last few weeks, it just so happened that Tyrone Tracy looks even better now as a prospect. But Tracy was a big W for me, and it was probably my favorite process win of the entire season. And really, it was all driven by talent evaluation and knowing what the running back brought to the table versus the other guys in his backfield. Now, like I said, there were other things that I could have gotten to today, but I wanted to focus on a range of things for us to all think about as we get into the 2025 season. Hopefully the ones that I chose were helpful. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Blue Sky and on Twitter at Late Round QB. Remember to pre-order that prospect guide right now over on lateround.com. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys on Friday with a brand new mailbag episode.